Good morning and good afternoon to our friends in Europe. I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, coming to you from Washington, D.C. And it's my pleasure to welcome you for the CEPA discussion on keeping a spotlight on Belarus's fight for democracy. Following the fraudulent presidential election last summer, pro-democracy protesters have been taking to the streets across Belarus to fight for their democratic rights and freedom and for a different future in Belarus. After many months of consistent repression, these protests continue today in spite of the harmful response by the Belarusian authorities and Moscow's continued intervention and interference in Belarus today. At CEPA, we've done a huge amount of work to highlight why the international community should be paying close attention to what is happening in Belarus, working closely together to ensure a free and democratic future for the Belarusian people, who should be able to choose and make choices about the kind of country they want to live in. Through our Future of Belarus workstream, which has included papers and articles, we have been trying to raise awareness among US policymakers and European policymakers about the importance of the struggle that the people of Belarus are undertaking today. And this discussion will very much focus on what the transatlantic community can do in response, and especially as the Biden administration seeks a foreign policy agenda that is rooted in democratic principles, human rights, and the rule of law. I'm absolutely thrilled to have with us at CEPA a fantastic panel to discuss what the international community response should be, and especially what role the United States should play in the struggle taking place in Belarus today. I will hand it over to my colleague, CEPA Senior Fellow Edward Lucas, to lead the discussion, but I just want to say that I'm very grateful to have the US Ambassador to Minsk, to Belarus, Ambassador Fisher, joining us for this discussion today, among the other speakers who Edward will do a wonderful job introducing. So Edward Lucas, over to you.
Well, hello and good afternoon from London. Good morning from Washington. And I'm really pleased to be talking about Belarus, which has been a subject so close to my heart since the 1980s. And we yearn for the days when we won't have to talk so much about Belarus, or maybe we'll be able to talk about nice things instead of the struggle for freedom and democracy there. I'm joined by a great panel of people who are deeply involved in Belarus. In alphabetical order, we have Michael Carpenter, who's the Managing Director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania. We have Ambassador Julie Fisher from the US Embassy in Belarus, but she's actually in Warsaw. And we have Rebecca Harms, who's a former member of the European Parliament from Germany. She's in Stuttgart at the moment and has been one of the most vocal advocates of the Belarusian cause on Twitter. And if you don't follow her, please do so. And finally, last but not least, we have Linas Linkevičius, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and former Defense Minister of Lithuania, who's been leading the charge from Lithuania to support Belarus, not just in the last couple of years, but for many years before then. And it's been so important to see the way in which not just the Lithuanian government and elected officials, but also the Lithuanian people have stood shoulder to shoulder with their Belarusian brothers and sisters in this extraordinary time. So we have about just over half an hour for our discussion, and we're going to keep it short and sweet. And there's basically two things I want to talk about. One is, what can we do to keep the outside world focused on this, focused on supporting the opposition, focused on pushing back against the regime in Minsk, but also pushing back against the regime in Moscow, which is standing behind Alexander Lukashenka. And the second thing is, what advice can we give to the opposition? Is there anything they should be doing more of, anything less, anything differently? That I think will keep us very busy for the next half hour or so. I'm going to go first of all to Ambassador Julie Fisher, because you have perhaps one of the most difficult and interesting jobs in the entire American diplomatic universe, and we'd love to hear your perspectives on what's going on and what more we can do as we move away from the focus of the last couple of weeks or few weeks we've had on eastern Ukraine, perhaps moving back to Belarus. How can we help? Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you, Edward, and thank you to Alina and to SIPA for convening this group. You're right, it's a really amazing panel, and I'm really honored to join you today. As you noted, I am in Warsaw. I am not calling in from Minsk, and to some extent that is indicative of my trip here. I just was in Vilnius as well, is indicative of exactly this effort. How can we continue to keep attention on the struggle for the rule of law and democracy in Belarus? And I think there's an important role for the United States in doing this. It is incredibly important to Secretary Blinken, to the team at the State Department, to the White House as well, that we very visibly engage with those that are leading the protest movement. And I have endeavored to do that, whether it was on my previous travels, whether I do it from Washington, and what I'm doing here in Warsaw. It is engagement with our allies and our partners in the region. It is my direct engagement with those leading the protest movement, wherever they may be, and working with those NGOs and organizations that are shining a spotlight on the repression, the abuses, the violence that is being brought to the people of Belarus, that has been brought since last summer. I think it is incredibly important for those of us who want to keep this spotlight on Belarus that we continue to recognize that simply because we don't see the hundreds of thousands of people in the street that we saw last fall, that does not mean the political crisis is over. What I see, what I hear, what I understand is that the people of Belarus, have been victim to the violence brought by the regime, right? We see more than 350 political prisoners detained today. We see, people being detained, questioned because of the colors they choose to wear or the laundry that they hang outside their apartments. This kind of repression is unprecedented, certainly in this century in Belarus. And we would have to go back about, 80 or 90 years to find a similar parallel to this level of repression. It is absolutely essential that the international community speaks out, that human rights organizations are speaking out, and all of those who support the rule of law and democracy speak out. I feel incredibly lucky. You noted, Edward, that this is a bit of an unusual diplomatic assignment, and it is. But one of the ways in which I feel I have a tremendous amount of support from across Washington is the way in which there has been tremendous bipartisan support in Congress that we see evidenced in the Belarus Democracy Act and in resolutions and other statements that have been proposed since the passage of the Belarus Democracy Act. There is tremendous support from the administration to really speak out about what is happening in Belarus. And that certainly makes our role, my role in particular, much clearer in such a case. So I am really quite grateful for that. Perhaps advice to the opposition is a question I'll come back on, but let me just say it is a big part of what I'm doing while I'm on the road, while I was in Vilnius and while I'm here, is listening to the opposition, listening to what it is they think they need from us. What are the signals they are counting on from us? What are the tools of pressure they are looking for us to bring? And thinking through how we, in coordination with our partners in Europe, our allies in Europe, how it is that we can best bring this process, see these political prisoners released, and bring the parties to the table for a meaningful dialogue. Back over to you.
Thanks so much for that, Ambassador. And we look forward to the day when not only you return to Minsk, but will return to have diplomatic relations with the government that actually likes the United States and everything it stands for. It can't come soon enough. Linas, I'd like to come to you next, if I may, because Lithuania played a really important role in kickstarting this kind of new wave of democratic sentiment with the reburial of Kalinowski, and we've seen huge demonstrations, the road down to the Belarusian border with a kind of reminiscent of the Baltic Way, this turnout of Lithuanians. So it's been a terrific story in terms of Lithuanian support for the opposition. But what can we do now? What's the next practical step, apart from obviously just highlighting the abuse of power and the political prisoners and so on?
Yeah, thank you, Edward. Indeed, we have seen some traces of kind of new thinking during this ceremony of reburial, as you rightly said. But if you agree with me, a couple of years ago, few expected anything like that from Belarus. It looked like everything so stable, too stable, island of stability in that sense, and nobody expected anything. And suddenly happens that they are now surprising all Europe by what they are doing. In spite of all these repressions, they are still bold, courageous, risking not just comfort or jobs, but even life sometimes, but even women, you see, so active and so impressive what they are doing every day. And this is definitely also surprising all of us. And to some extent, it's also kind of example for Europe that this is not a given what we have, this democracy, freedom, somebody has to fight. So this is talking about advices. First of all, we should look at ourselves, what we should do. And I believe what the international community, as Ambassador Fisher said rightly, that to keep a spot on Belarus. Yes, but what we have to do, we have to find the ways how to support civil society. It's easy to say, not easy to do, because we know that it's not so easy to transfer resources to those who are suffering economically, physically, and because of regime, so we cannot do that. But nevertheless, using some funds, and again, Yasna and other organizations, we should be flexible enough to find the ways how to reach out to these people in need. First of all, support of civil society, then pressure on outgoing leadership, to leave no chance for them, to expect that the Western democracy will agree with this new normal, because regime believes to survive, because time is running, 9 months, you said yourself, and that would be a situation where unavoidable, so to say, reality, and they expect that will happen. So we should leave no hope for that. And we will not recognize this country until they will organize new elections, until they will release political prisoners, which number is huge and not compatible with the number of political prisoners which was 6-7 years ago, by the way. So this is something we have also to push quite clearly, and also provide a vision to the society, what they will have if democracy will come, so to say, your country would be more or less democratic. And that's in the cooking in the European Union, also this package of support for democratic Belarus. And that's the way to go. And for opposition, it's traditional. We have to, well, hope that they will be as united as possible, because temptation to be split, that's always here, and this is really weakening all these voices. What Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is doing, this is the wonderful example, somebody who was never a politician, had no ambitions, and definitely you can accuse her for that anymore, but it happened that she was in the center of attention, and she's doing her best, I believe, in really symbolizing this movement of resistance, of opposition. And we are proud that we are able to help them as much as possible, but we are not working for them. They are doing themselves what they are doing. And she's this week also traveling to Austria, to Italy, numerous international contacts. And I believe this is very important, but it's not enough. It's not enough. So we have to think very seriously how to make these efforts more visible and definitely more tangible, especially helping these people in need. So in short, that would be my answer to your question, Edward.
Thanks so much, Linas, and I hope we can get into some of the detail on that later on. Let me go to you next, Rebecca, because as Linas pointed out, the role of the European Union and of European countries here is vital, and we see really terrific support from Lithuania and great interest in Poland and some of the other countries. A bit less so as we go further west. So from your position as in Germany and as a former member of the European Parliament, do you feel Europe's doing enough? And if it should do more, what should that more be?
So it's the old question, which we were asking about all the conflicts and even about war situations in Eastern European countries, EAP countries, during the last years. And so it might be unfair, but I think Europe and especially also Germany are not doing enough in this case of Belarus again. I'm convinced that without the engagement from the Baltic countries and Poland in the beginning of the protests after the elections in Belarus last year, so without the pressure from these countries in Eastern and Central Europe, Europe's reaction would have been even weaker. I was yesterday joining one of the meetings which take place all over Germany every weekend, organized by the Belarusian diaspora, showing solidarity with their friends and activists in Belarus. And I can tell you it's really, for me, again and again, good to join in Berlin or Bremen or Hanover or elsewhere. But it's always a bit a shame how little interest these people get. So we have to think about what we can do to make the voices stronger, the Belarusian voices stronger across the European Union. It will be, again, a challenge to deconstruct the lies by Lukashenko and the lies by also Putin about what's going on in Belarus in this case. And I think to strengthen the European will to stand with the people in need, so this starts with a real good and ongoing information. And what I fear right now is that people are getting used with the bad news from Belarus and not paying that much attention. It's getting to a new normal. And then I also fear that so this latest move by Putin to amass these big number of troops around Ukrainian borders, also in Belarusia, and now withdraw those troops, more or less, leads to a situation in the EU that most of the people will say, okay, so Putin is going for a peaceful strategy. War did not happen. There was no escalation as everybody predicted. So we can relax. And this would be the completely wrong reaction to what happened. My last sentence here is we have to think about Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Armenia as a set of problems, but as a set of problems, challenges for the EU, which belong together. We should stop to talk only about, for example, the Ukraine conflict. We have a conflict with Putin and the Kremlin.
Well, thanks very much for that, Rebecca. And it's a perfect springboard to go over to Michael Carpenter for maybe the bigger picture, because fundamentally this, as Rebecca was saying, this isn't just a problem about Belarus. I don't think Lukashenko would be there if it wasn't for the way that Russia has developed and with the support he's getting from Russia. So talk us through, from your perspective from Washington, D.C., Michael, where are we and what could we do more?
Well, thanks, Edward. I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that Linas Linkevičius said, as well as Rebecca just now, in terms of sort of fleshing out the positive vision for Belarus. I think it's very important in an information-constrained environment that we work to get more information, credible information into Belarus. This is where the Russians really have a monopoly on propaganda, and it is now at a fever pitch. The things that are being said on Belarusian state TV, in the press, it is being managed from Moscow, and it is just over the top. And so I think one of the tools that we have at our disposal is the informational tool. And so we can fund the types of programs, whether it's on social media or in other channels, that can get credible information to the people. Whenever I think of Belarus today, I'm reminded, as Rebecca has rightly noted, not just of the other struggles between democracy and authoritarianism on Russia's periphery, whether it be Georgia or Ukraine or Armenia, but also of the experience, say, of Poland in 1980 with the birth of the Solidarity movement, which was a very similar sort of dual national and civic awakening that, as everybody remembers, was brutally crushed in December of 1981, and which was forced underground through a series of repressions over the course of 8+ years until the Roundtable Agreement of June 1989. And during that entire time, however, Solidarity was crushed, but it still remained alive in people's minds. And I think that is crucial. We have to sustain that civic and national consciousness within Belarusian civil society. And so that means painting a picture of what could come if there is, in fact, a democratic breakthrough. And here I have in mind things like economic reconstruction support, putting on the table a credible plan for the economic reconstruction of Belarus that would be done jointly by the US and the EU, so that there is a credible plan for what to do sort of the day after. But then in the meantime, standing very forcefully with the democratic movement and with civil society when it's under pressure. And again, giving them the tools to communicate and get that information in there. Because let's be honest, I mean, the Russians have many more tools at their disposal than Western countries do. And they essentially control a lot of this space physically. And so there has been a revolution in the minds of the Belarusian people, and sustaining that revolution in their own consciousness is sort of what we need to do, in addition to all the sanctions, other pressure that the Western governments can bring to bear on the regime. They have to really focus on that revolution of the mind.
Thanks so much, Mike. I love that idea of the revolution of the mind, and it is so different from the Belarus we remember from the 1990s. That there's been such a crystallization of national consciousness, and the expectations have changed, and it's so important to maintain that. But Linas, let me come back to you next, because there's a kind of tension between our desire to punish the regime and keep Belarus in the spotlight as a center of human rights abuses and dictatorship and all these things, and the desire to open our arms and our hearts and our political and economic engagement to the people of Belarus. And it's quite difficult, because I think in a way, over the last 20 years, we've put more and more sanctions on the Lukashenka regime, and that has to some extent fueled their narrative that the West isn't interested, that Belarus is isolated, has to look after itself. So how do we balance the sanctions on one hand and the engagement on the other?
No, it's, first of all, let's consider that these sanctions are really very limited what we are doing. Even if you compare with the sanctions which were introduced before 2013, let's say, right? So there were 170 or 180 something on the list, and we lifted sanctions when they released political prisoners, which were 6 or something like that number of political prisoners. Now we see a huge number. We have less than 100 on the list, and it took time until we put Lukashenko himself on the list, as you remember, because of the reason to have these channels and to influence. But this is naivete, this is really very important lessons which have to learn. And without substantial pressure, we will reach nothing, basically. And it's not just applicable to Belarus, it's also to Russia. It's important that Russia is mentioned. That's most important stakeholder in the situation. And what Rebecca just mentioned really reminds me the common attitude that we should really retreat or something happening, improvement or whatever, about withdrawal of troops. It reminds me, as I told probably many times, of somebody stealing $1,000 and then giving back $100 and everybody happy how he's cooperative. So Russia behaves like that, and this trick is working very well. And I'm not in a position to criticize my former colleague Heiko Maas, but when he said that no additional sanctions needed, we have to focus now on dialogue. It's not because of dialogue, Navalny is still alive. Not because of dialogue, because of pressure. And it's not just dialogue can solve the problems, but also substantial pressure from outside. And when it's coming back to Belarus, it's also not a big secret that they are really now using time how to destroy these remainings of sovereignty and independence of that country, which are still existing, and digest this country as soon as possible. And what they are doing behind the scenes, nobody knows, but these visits, of Prime Minister to Minsk and the Defense Minister to Minsk, and also Lukashenko twice met Putin. God knows what they were discussed, but definitely they were discussing how to speed up this integration, so-called integration of these countries. And definitely they will de facto will lose their independence totally, which is already almost lost. So Russia is a key factor here, and retreating and making some compromises is not the way to go. And this is to be said not just about Navalny or Ukraine, but also about Belarus. This is exactly that. So what means the balance? It's not a balance. It should be definitely on one hand to support the civil society, but no cooperation with the government. It's important not to legitimize outgoing leadership, because what we are doing, they are now fixing every step, every movement, what will help them to legitimize themselves in the eyes of their own people, and to say that this is business as usual. There are problems. There were problems before where we were sorting out, and that's so to say not a big problem for them. And this is not the message we have to send to these people, and also to the community, to this, so to see those who are fighting. I will repeat probably, when I'm looking at these people marching in these courtyards, these small groups after them being detained, and really fewer and fewer of them. So one can make a conclusion that protests are not so big and so few people, but you should remember always that all of them are jailed or so to say punished in other ways, and this is really not something we should make conclusions out of this vision. People are definitely fighting, and they need support. What we can do to show the solidarity, empathy, and also tangible support. And definitely by far not legitimizing this outgoing leadership, which is already compromised, and they should understand that no other way. New elections, release of prisoners, and maybe somebody will start to talking then. So this is important to know, because my feeling is that some colleagues in the Western countries are ready for compromises, and they already kind of fatigue of this history because it lasts so long, and the temptation to be as pragmatic as possible always overwhelming, and this is something we should warn ourselves first of all not to do.
Yes, and Ambassador Fisher, you're obviously plugged into all the diplomatic discussions about Belarus. Do you detect a willingness in some quarters to try and find a compromise? Because I've certainly heard people say it would be better to keep Belarus independent, even with Lukashenko in power, than to see it just swallowed by Russia. I personally think that's a false dichotomy. But insofar as you can pick up the scent of realpolitik going on, what is the discussion, and how can we channel it in a more direction that goes more suitable for the Belarusian people?
I couldn't agree with you more about this false dichotomy. This question of, Lukashenko has positioned himself as the guarantor of Belarusian independence. And truly, for 26 years, there isn't anyone who has done more to yield Belarus's sovereignty and independence to their neighbor in the East than he has, right? And we have watched as he has done this. So the question is not, are we going to drive Belarus into the arms of the Kremlin? It has already happened. That is where they are. And the question is that where the people of Belarus want to be? And is that where they expect their nation to be when there's a transition? And so I do think, truly for those in the West, right, whether we're talking about, those who are closest to Belarus and who border Belarus, or throughout Europe, I feel that, what happens in Belarus should matter no matter which part of Europe a member state of the European Union is from. This question of whether or not the 10 million people, the citizens of Belarus, should have a voice in their future is one that should concern everyone in Europe. This is not sustainable. There is a political crisis, and there will be a resolution to it in some way. It may take some time. There are a lot of forces of pressure that are building inside Belarus, and unless Lukashenka is willing to imprison, I don't know where the limits are of how many he will put in prison, but I don't think he can capture the revolution of the mind, as Michael has referenced it today. He cannot put all of those in prison. So, his fear tactics are having an impact on the willingness of individuals to come out to the streets. But I would urge those in Europe and North America who are thinking about this question not to be lulled into a sense of complacency about what is happening there. There is very much a political struggle that is ongoing.
Thanks very much for that. And I think it's really hard to try and fight back against the kind of tide of patronizing ignorance that just flows in from people who know so little about Belarus and are so keen to come up with what they think are neat solutions to the country's dilemmas. We're almost out of time. Amazing how quickly we've gone through. I want to just finish off by having a quick round where we should imagine we can give some advice to the opposition. I think, looking back, no one can question their bravery, and you've already highlighted, several of you, the unity, and that's very important because that has not been, to put it mildly, a hallmark of the Belarusian opposition in previous years. They've often enjoyed fighting each other even more than they've enjoyed fighting the regime. So we say now we do have unity, and we have the revolution of the mind, and we have tremendous bravery. What I'm still looking for is a strategy. And I don't know what that strategy would be. And in a way, as an outsider, it's not my job to advise. But I'd be very interested to hear from the panel, with all your experience of how other countries have fought for their freedom. Poland's been mentioned. Lithuania is a champion of the anti-Soviet struggle. What should we recommend, at least, that the opposition leadership consider as they try and develop a strategy in these very difficult conditions? Let me go to you first, Mike, and then I'll go through the rest of the panel in reverse order. In an ideal world, what should the opposition be doing?
Well, that's a great question, Edward, and it's a very tricky one. Look, I tend to look at Belarus right now, as I referenced earlier, from a long-term perspective. And I think that's what the opposition leadership should do as well. This is not about securing a victory in the next week or even in the next month. I think this is about sustaining this civic consciousness, perhaps over a matter of years, perhaps through a very dark period, or maybe not. I mean, it's very hard to predict the future and what will happen, say, 6 months from now. And the COVID pandemic has shifted so many politics just in the course of the last 14, 15 months. So, I think it's incumbent on the leadership of the opposition to sort of sustain this unity, as you mentioned, but also to sort of live by the ideals of this peaceful revolution and sort of imbue it with that continuing spirit of peaceful opposition to repression, to authoritarianism, to autocracy, to brutal dictatorship. And sort of sustain people's hopes over time. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think a crucial piece of this is information. It is getting into the living rooms of people in Vitebsk and in Grodno and in Minsk and in small villages around Belarus, not allowing the FSB spinmeisters from sort of occupying all of this terrain and laying out their concoctions and their propaganda, but actually putting forward a vision that people can relate to.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Sadly, it'd be great if it was a sprint. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And this, I think these sort of ideas of the Polish underground in the 80s and Václav Havel's writings about living in truth give us a sort of template about how you can wage the sort of the long struggle for democracy. But Rebecca, let me go to you next, because the German Greens have just pioneered the idea of grassroots politics, and from the being dismissed as a bunch of irrelevant hairy hippies back in the 80s when I was a student in Germany, and now a few decades later, that was in the 1980s. Now you're polling neck and neck with the CDU, and may well be the highly likely to be in the next government. So you know all about marathons rather than sprints. But what advice from your perspective as a very successful grassroots politician? What advice would you give to the opposition?
Also, remembering what we did as this flower power generation in the early years of the Greens, especially also my anti-nuclear movement, we thought we would face fierce battles, in our non-violent resistance against nuclear industry in Germany. Meanwhile, we recognize what in Europe real resistance, strong resistance against authoritarian regimes means. And I find it amazing to see how the Belarusians develop the methods of nonviolent protest. I think, really, they are champions in creating pictures which people see and immediately understand that this is about Belarus at home and abroad. And I think it's really right what Michael said. We should support them to continue. We should support them to be able to run a marathon. But on the other hand, we should also think about the instruments, how to support them. And since information and reporting is so important also to win the informational war, which also takes place in and around Belarus, we should really also not forget to give them the means they need. I think this should be possible. And I remember quite well how difficult it was, for example, when Belsat had to leave Belarus, and we had to find first a place and then money to continue. So money for journalism plays a major role. We should also think about how to open our channels, our newspapers for the voices from Belarus, and not only for our correspondents and experienced people. I like to read your comments, Edward, but I think it's very, very important to have the original voices from Belarus distributed, amplified all over the European Union. And my last point, so the West and the EU have to make it very clear that we know that Lukashenko will not go peacefully. He does not intend so, and he is backed by Putin. And so the EU and best United States and the EU together should really think about the right pressure against the president sitting in the Kremlin. Because if we tackle this problem, this is the core signal also to our friends in Belarus. I know that they said in the very beginning, it's not about geostrategy, this conflict, but they are in between the West and the Kremlin. So whether they want it or not.
Absolutely.
So to tackle the man who is the guarantor of Lukashenko is key for the support of Belarusian opposition.
I don't know whether it was you, Rebecca, or somebody said that the Belarusians may not be interested in geopolitics, but unfortunately geopolitics is interested in them.
It's and really, Lucas, Edward, it is, from my point of view, young people all over Europe have to understand what kind of fights young people take. An hour of a flight east of Berlin.
Yeah, yeah,
and
absolutely.
They have not yet understood. They have not yet understood.
No. No, it's really inspirational to see these. But Linas, let me come to you next, because you may well have some thoughts on what Rebecca has said, and Lithuanians absolutely know how to do grassroots organizing. But it seems to me what we haven't touched on is whether there's any more potential to split the regime rather than attack it from the bottom. And we saw at the beginning a few ambassadors and ministers and people jumping ship and abandoning the Lukashenka sort of circle, but that seems to have tailed off. But if we could get the riot police to stay at home, the army or the other organs of power or other members of the government to start distancing themselves, that would send a very powerful message, and that hasn't been tremendously successful. So is there any room for a strategy focusing a bit more on splitting the regime and weakening it from within?
You can call it splitting of regime, or you can call it kind of message of reconciliation of society, basically. And that's also very important, especially for the power structures, because if they will feel pushed into the corner, they will defend until the end of their life to survive, basically, because some of them, especially young people, if they will not see a future of themselves in this country, they will definitely kind of defend themselves. And those who are not committed crimes, that was said, but not very clearly. I would recommend to do that in more strong voice, and that would be really important. So it's a reconciliation of the society, because that's part of the game. Also, I would repeat unity. Unity is very important, because temptation to split always is here. Prepare to take lead in the country, to take power, and to prepare administrative capacity is also important, because they should spread this message to the public of the vision of future Belarus. People should know what they should expect with this new power coming, and this is part of the game. And Belarus is not only geographically in Europe, but should be also part by all other means, what I believe very important for the young generation to see their future. So these would be a few comments, and I believe that's doable, possible, and we can, well, help them to do that.
Great. Well, Ambassador, final word to you. You're in the hottest of hot seats, as I said earlier, when it comes to Western policy in Belarus. And just imagine, if you could, that you were speaking as bluntly as your position allows. What advice would you give?
I think perhaps I run the risk of being more blunt than most, but look, I think the first thing I would tell you is that I would say is actually the protest movement, the leaders of this democracy movement, they have gotten so far really without so much advice from us. And so the first thing I would tell them is they have tremendous instincts to trust. And, those of us from the West have some experience I think we can offer, but this is theirs. This is their country. And first and foremost, what they know and understand about their own country is of course the most important. Of course, Linas is exactly right about unity. And, what I would say is all of the different voices that are part of this movement are necessary. Each and every person inside Belarus, outside Belarus, in Vilnius, in Warsaw, in London, in the various locations, the members of the diaspora abroad, all of their energies, all of their efforts, all of their support is necessary to bring transition, no matter when that is, whether it is, as you referenced earlier, whether it is in the immediate term or the midterm or the longer term. It is important for the leaders of this movement to be ready for all of those scenarios. I think that, the work they do right now in terms of how they signal their intentions about the future Belarus they want to build, I think this will have an enormous impact on their ability to affect the decision-making of those who are in Belarus and in positions of power, right? So it is about spelling out the economic opportunity they see for the future. It's about spelling out relations with all of Belarus's neighbors and how they see that proceeding after a transition, right? All of this contributes to their ability to succeed. But first and foremost, I really would urge them to trust the instincts that have brought them this far, because they have done such an impressive job.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on, trust your instincts. But I think also this idea of articulating the vision is so important, and anything we can do to help root today's democratic struggle in the traditions of the past, particularly the Grand Duchy and the this largely forgotten but very inspiring episode of constitutional law and the multiculturalism which was there in the early modern era, which has in which today's Belarus has such roots, is really important. So there we are. This is certainly not our last discussion on Belarus. I hope anyone watching this inside Belarus will be pleased to see the expertise and solidarity that comes from our panel. If you're watching from outside Belarus, please think what you can do to inform yourself more about this epic struggle which is going on in somewhere that is, as Rebecca pointed out, really so close to parts of Europe that don't have to worry about these things. Please continue to follow us on the SIPA website as we continue to work on this, bringing Belarusian and non-Belarusian voices into the wider policy arena. And it just remains me to thank very much Ambassador Fisher, temporarily, we hope, in Warsaw, Linas Linkevičius, for many years in government, now enjoying a break outside government for Vilnius, Rebecca Harms, Belarus's best friend in the European Parliament for many years, now in Stuttgart, and Mike Carpenter in Washington, DC. And from me in London, Edward Lucas, goodbye and thank you very much.